All right, y'all. It's 5 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and start. Thank y'all for coming out. I really appreciate seeing everybody here support me. I know this is something that's very detailed and very minute studies, but stick with me. I'm going to try to keep it going. And again, I really appreciate everybody coming out to support me. So I got to choose a topic for this lecture recital, and what I chose, it's a very fancy title, so I'm going to read it. Effects of the African Diaspora on music during the transatlantic slave trade from Africa through Latin America. So what this means, essentially, is when slavery and the transatlantic slave trade happened, there were an entire groups of people that were brought from their homelands to new countries. So when that happened, their culture, their influences, and the music that they brought with them changed. And all this is a paper and a presentation that describes how it changed. So everything started in Africa, which African Diaspora, and then all these different genres I'll be following, Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Cuban, it's pretty apparent that it's from Africa. So a lot of people like to think that civilization in Africa was very, not very complicated. It was very rudimentary and simple because of years of people painting it that way, because Western civilization is just different. But that's not very true. There were very many overlapping cultures and civilizations that really build into what we're talking about. Now, I didn't have time or enough studies to get into every single thing, so I broke it down into what's important. Everything started with Egypt. So Egypt, for hundreds and hundreds of years, was a very big stronghold of cultural influence and information. After the dissolution of Egypt, everything started to build. So when Egypt was in power, everything was moving from the southwest to the northeast. And by that I mean all slave routes, all information, all money. Because in Egypt, there was the connection to the Mediterranean Sea. So the Mediterranean Sea is what connected them to China, it's what connected them to all of the Arabian countries, and that's how they got their money, that's how they got their influence spread throughout the world. So as Egypt started to die down, other countries came in and began to fill the gap of where Egypt was breaking down as far as their civilization. One of those was the Kingdom of Kush. One of those was the Kingdom of Kush. Now, the Kingdom of Kush was very important because they are the ones that really sedimented the northwestern trade routes, and that's because they were very skilled iron workers. Now, this is just a brief history. I know this is a music thing, and I swear I'm getting there. After that, the Kingdom of Aksum built up, and it's something that came, and very similarly, it had a huge influx on these trade routes because they were very high in salt. So that started the gold for salt trade, and one of these other empires was Ghana. Now, the Empire of Ghana is not Ghana as we know it today. It actually dissolved long before the country of Ghana now. But this big route kept everything going from the southwest to the northeast. And this kept things like Arabian textiles and European clothing, Arabian glass, Chinese pottery, everything going the same direction. But as these cultures started to die down and break out, other phases of civilizations came in. So the Songhay Empire, the Empire of Mali, and the Oyo Empire. So these are very important because they resedimented these gold routes, and the Mali Empire was very important because it fixed everything else in Africa. Everything's running through Mali, and then everything is going back up to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, where the music comes in, instruments have, for centuries, been used in different ways other than just people getting together to listen and play music. The Kingdom of Mali, the Empire of Mali, had a lot of enemies on all sides because they've taken over these gold deposits and everybody was coveting that, everybody wanted to have it. So one thing that the Numu, the blacksmiths of the time in Mali, invented was the djembe. Now these were carved, and this is a modernized version, but they were carved from logs and they had stretched skin heads over the top with ropes. So the reason that the djembe was very important is because the king of Mali would use certain rhythms that they would then transmit across long distances, because this drum is very loud. One of the rhythms was called Ani Sokoma. So what that is literally the king is coming. So this rhythm meant to the next village, to the next town over, that the king is coming to that village, and now you have to prepare the king's food, the king's guard, everything in that town needs to be set up. But what they're doing is they're literally taking the language, Anisokama, which at the time was Malinke, and they took that word and they broke the rhythms down. So all that was, and this becomes known as speech mode. So there's a lot of examples of music, especially African music, being based in language. So how they say things are very important. Another example of something being used to transmit messages was the Yoruban gangan. This is the talking drum. So it's very important because there's two heads on either side and it's rope tuned. So you can actually squeeze the middle and change the pitch. So a lot of this becomes very important because the hunters would use it to send messages short distances between village to village or in the Amazon when they're hunting to send very important messages.
Drums are not only musical instruments, they are also a means of communication. People talk to each other by using drums. Many African languages are based on high and low sounds. For example, when the Ashantis say good morning, it sounds like this. Ma-chi, ma-chi. The word has a low sound and a high sound. Ma-chi. It can also be said by a drum that can beat both high and low sounds. Thank you, Mr. Ite. Mr. Ite has just told me you are welcome.
So since this language was used to make these rhythms, if you pay attention enough, especially people from the culture, they can identify the rhythms to hear the language that they're inflicting. So that's hello in the language that he was just talking about. But it's more than just simple greetings. It was used for very important things, but the thing that comes out of it is signal mode. So not only are we using rhythms to dictate what we're saying, we're using the inflection of how we say it. So this could be very important, for example.
Mr. Ite is signaling, a line is near the village.
I want to know there's a line near my village. They're saying very important messages across short distances, similar to how the djembe was. So we've now seen these two modes, but the things that's important is these were very practical examples, very efficient ways to use instruments. And obviously there were a lot other ways, as in the balafon, which I unfortunately don't have. It's like a xylophone or a marimba, but like the grandfather. And then a udu, which was a ceramic vase that was used to carry water. And this is something very similar. It's an Igbo, but it's a more modernized example. So there's a lot of different sounds that they would make. And it was really just, they would pick something up and then they would make music out of it and they would play with it because it was simple and it was easy. It's not as complex as we have now to where we have to go to the store and pick out an instrument, buy an instrument. They were making music because music was how they experienced the world. It wasn't just something they did. So with this phase of all these empires came the slave trade. So everybody's aware of the transatlantic slave trade and all the people that are involved. But as far as this paper, I really focused on Portugal, Spain, and France. Because Portugal started the slave trade in 1512, where they came down the west coast and started trading. They realized there was a lot of gold, and then they started taking individuals and kidnapping them, and then it led into the entire slave trade as we know it. But now we see everything going off the west coast. We see everything going because of the slave trade, that instead of everything going from southwest to northeast, we're seeing it go the opposite. Because that's where the ships are coming. That's where the trade is on, and then off the port, off of where Ghana and Togo and Benin are, we're seeing a lot of influence through those ports into what we now know as the new land, the newfound land. Awesome. So two of the main people that were involved in the slave trade as far as being the slaves were the Ewe people and the Yoruba people. Now the Ewe in green is everything that was in the northwest, and Yoruba was everything that was in the central, which was at the time was called Zaire. So one thing, again, I think is very important is African percussion is an expression of who they were through their language, through their culture, and through how they lived their lives. It's not a genre of drums and people writing instruments for drums. Whereas we now will write an instrument, a rhythm, and a song for a drum, and then play it. They would find things that were already existent in their daily lives and then put it to those instruments. Now that comes to where we have the three modes of how they make music. We've talked about speech and signal, then there's dance mode. And quite literally, dance mode was rhythms that their bodies would make and their feet would make when they danced, and everything involving their motion. Now these rhythms, again, they're not the way we would do things. In Western music, how we do things is we write music and a choreographer comes in and they write things out in order to dance to that music. This was things that they were dances that were preset for different ceremonies, for different religious reasons, and then they would set the instruments to pitch, to rhythm for that purpose. Now, in Ewe, there's a very simple lineup of drums. This is actually one of the Ewe drums that you can see. And thankfully, Dr. Jordan let me borrow his drum. It's actually an authentic Ewe drum he got in his time in Ghana, which is very interesting. I'm very appreciative. But through these, we have a simple setup of the boba and the esimevu, which were the father and the mother drums. Now, number 6, the boba, is the mother drum, but back and forth, these two instruments would play a call and response. Sometimes one had the call, sometimes other, but in general, when they framed the music, these were the leaders of the ensemble. Now, the Kidi and Soga were the children. They would follow their respective parent, and in the responses, in these calls, they would know that this person played this rhythm, this is the response I'm going to have to it. Now, these three, we do have another drum, but Kagan, number 3, is just like the other drums. It's a lot higher pitch, and its main purpose, it didn't do the call and response. Its main purpose was to keep tempo. So whatever rhythm it had was a consistent rhythm throughout the entire piece. And the ahache, which is the beaded instrument in the middle, very similar to this, it was also used for timekeeping, as well as the genkogwi, which is the bell that's in number 1. Now, the ahache is very important as far as this project and African percussion goes, because it is the great-grandfather of many instruments that involve gourds and shakers, just like the shakere that we will talk about in a minute. Now, the genkogwi is the same thing. It's an Ewe instrument that became many different things because of cultural changes and how it was used. But the most important thing is the things that were coming with these ensembles were based off of when Westerners came to Africa and observed these things, they were trying to write it down, because we write down music. A lot of African music was not written down. It was things that they did word of mouth, and it was things they did just on a daily basis culturally. So one of the important rhythms that we got was the bell pattern, which I'll play on the gecko? No. Was the bell pattern, and it's very consistent. You're going to see a lot more of that. And then there's also a hemiola. Now, hemiola, many of us know, is when you are hearing something that doesn't quite fit with how it's written, and it's based off the pulses and the beats within the measure. Now, the Yoruban people had a very different way of doing things. It wasn't a simple lineup. There were very many families of instruments and very drums, because there were a lot more Yoruban people in Africa than there were Ewe people. The Ewe were refugees from the north that got moved to the south and then were taken, whereas the Yoruban people were always in Zaire. One of these families is the Sakara. Now, I don't have any Sakara drums here. Now, those are baked clay rings that they stretch skin across, and they use sticks to play. There's also the Ogido. Now, the Ogido look a lot like conga, and they're even called the Yoruban conga, but they're a lot of things that are consistent with conga, but we still haven't got there. This is still many centuries before the actual conga that we know now were ever invented. So then we have bata drums. Now you can see in the back of this ensemble, this is the classic bata drum, and it's played with a stick on on one side and a hand on the other. And this influence of the technique of what they use is very important later on as we see the development of this instrument. But in the back, we saw a triple drum that was played with 2 sticks, and that's the omele bata. Now you notice that drum wasn't played with a hand and stick, it was 2 sticks, which is a lot more what we're used to seeing is 2 sticks rather than any other implement. We also have the dun-dun family. Now dun-dun is the gan that I was talking about earlier. So all of these things come in to the different places they were from into, for example, Brazil. So Afro-Brazilian percussion, in Brazil, Portugal was the dominant force in the country. That was the country that was bringing in slaves, and they were bringing in influence and creating music. Now, everything that talks about Afro-Brazilian breaks it up into 3 different locations. Bahia, which is the main source of everything, and then everything south of Bahia, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and then everything north of Bahia, like Recital. Now, when we're going through, the first group of slaves that were brought over were not the Ewe or the Yoruba, they were the Bantu. Now, the Bantu were brought in, and they mixed with the indigenous peoples that were there, but over time, eventually, most of their influence got wiped out because they were worked to death, essentially. And then so many things were wiped out because with influences of West, they want you to be more like the West, so they don't let you keep your standard practices. And one of those was candomblé. Now, candomblé was their religion, and that acts as a foundation for a lot of the music I'm about to talk about. Now, the Ewe were brought in later, but they were regionally to the south of Bahia. They were everything in the south of Brazil. And then the Yoruba was everything north. So it's very important because we saw that Ewe is a very simple lineup, it does things a certain way, and then Yoruba was a very complex lineup of their instruments. So they broke up regionally, and then they really increased the differences over time because they were sectioned off. Now, one thing that we see a lot of was Portuguese instruments, like the caixa, surdo, and pandeiro, get brought to Brazil from the Portuguese military, and then they have influences from these African tribes on how they play it. So the caixa is very similar in concept to the gudu-gudu, which is a double-sticked instrument, and we then get the Brazilian caixa. Then we have the surdo, which is very similar to the dun-dun. It's a military marching Portuguese drum, but it turns vertical rather than horizontal like the dun-dun were often played. And we have the pandeiro, which is very similar to the sakara family, which was frame drums. And they use a lot of what they're talking about and a lot of the things they already had. What's very important to remember, to think about, is that slaves were not allowed personal belongings. They didn't have these instruments. They didn't have the ability to have these instruments. So all they had was the memories of how they used to play them, how their parents talked about playing them, and the techniques that they were already building up. Now the Ewe had a different approach to things because while they had the ability to remember how they did things, they really had an image of what their drums looked like. So one of those, the Atsunevo, was the father drum in the Ewe lineup, and from that they tried to recreate it and they came up with something called the Atabaque. Now, the Atabaque was a very ritualistic, religion-based drum off of the Bantu and Candomblé that it looks very similar to a conga, but we're still not at a conga yet. We still have like 300 years before we get to what we know as a conga. They also had the genkogwe. Now the genkogwe is the African double bell that a lot of people will mislabel as the agogo. But the agogo is the instrument that actually formed in Brazil, and this one doesn't do it. But the difference is it's not mounted on a singular post. There's actually a bend in the middle that you can squeeze these together and they click. So not only do you have 2 pitches, but you can also click them together to add another layer of rhythm.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Which adds a lot to the ensemble, adds a lot more noise, adds a lot more environment to the body of the music that they were making. But after time, slavery became outlawed and there was a big blending. So there was no longer a south and a north of Ewe and Yoruba. They all mixed together and all of their influences went in together to form new types of music. And throughout this time, there's not a lot of documented history, unfortunately, on a lot of the instruments and how they were formed, but a lot of it has to do with other influences that they've already seen. So the sakara was the family that was frame drums, and they had a stick to play. And it's very reasonable to see the connection between the tamborim, which is what I have here, which is a Brazilian instrument that formed in that 300-year period that not a lot of people have documented records of, because unfortunately they didn't document things historically for the lower class. Then there's also the reco, which one thing, unfortunately I don't have a güero with me, but a güero is a boarded instrument, kind of like this, but there are slits cut into it, and they would take a stick and they'd run down those slits and they'd make scratching noises. Now, when they came to South America, they didn't have as easy access to gourds, but they had a lot of bamboo. So that's when they made the reco, which is used and is often transplaced with güero, but it's just a difference of what it was made out of. And then over time, they were made into more modernized metal versions as industry involved. Now, the two things I focused on, there's a lot of different music styles, but I chose the two I felt were most important, which was samba and bailao. Now, bailao had a very simple lineup of instruments and music, and it was really a background music. It wasn't the entirety of what it was. So another example of instruments that formed, so the triangle already existed. It was a Western instrument, but triangulo was something that they started playing a different way, and they started adding on their own. The same way that this instrument down here is the zabumba, which was a military drum the same way as a surdo, but they played it as if it was bata. So they had a mallet in one hand and a stick in the other, which gave an interesting sound.
1, 2, 3, 4.
There are a lot more instruments, and then over time it became something that was more of a chart. You didn't have a strict feel, but you had these leaders that you saw as in Ewe instruments. You had these leaders that would come in and say, this is where we are, this is where we're changing. Now, here's an example. Which runs the ensemble from the side when the repenique, which was the drum in the middle, wasn't able to completely run everything. It's just an extra hand and there's handoffs. So not one person's in control, but it goes back and forth, the common responses. And this leads us to Afro-Cuban percussion. Similar thing, there's an outside force, there's a country with greater power coming to a new place, enslaving people, trying to advance their pecuniary goals and make money off of the people that live there. But this was Spain. Spain came into Cuba similar, just later into the process of the slave trade. The original people that were there were the Taino, the Simone, and the Caribs. But unfortunately, they were also kind of taken from history as far as the musical advancement, because there was this re-education program through Christianity that they wanted you to practice music the same way Westerners did. They wanted you to dress the same way. They wanted you to act and talk the same way. So most of what they were got wiped out. The same way that the Ewe and the Yoruba got brought to Brazil, they got brought to Cuba. But instead of being in different zones, it was in different times. Spain started in the west and then worked down to the Yoruba. So they formed, the Yoruba, Ewe came first and the Yoruba came over on top. Because Cuba was so small, they were so densely packed that there were no spaces for regions. And then again, Spain came in with their re-education programs, and they were trying to get rid of everything that they had brought with them culturally, all their religion. But the Ewe and the Yoruba, they came up with something called Santeria. Now, everybody's heard of Santeria, I'm sure. But one thing you might not know, Santeria is they would take the names of their gods, their African gods, and they would give them Christian names. And they would try to practice, at least on the outside, what it looked like they were practicing Christianity. That way, Spain would not come down on them for that. Now, one of the main things, I'd say the main thing I focused on for Cuba was mambo. Mambo is a very big song style even still today, but it was huge in Cuba. There's a lot of things that go into the creation of mambo, and I do not have the time to talk about all these, but the biggest things that go into it were the street music and the ballroom music. Street music was the lower and middle class, and the ballroom was the upper class. Now, a lot more instruments formed. Now, these are a lot of things that we see more commonly now. So, shakeré are still very much so used. We have bongos, which were formed, and we finally have conga. So, the shakeré is something that, again, it was a gourd. Now, this is a more modern shakeré. It's fiberglass, but it was something that was used to create rhythms, to create sound consistently through the piece in order to keep everyone in time. Okay, so now we finally have conga. Yay, conga. So conga have taken a long time. They look very similar to Ewe drums. They're played very similarly to the ogido, which were the Yoruban conga, and they also look very similarly to arabake. We finally got to conga, and they are huge in mambo. That's something that's very important. There's a lot of phrasing, a lot of very famous people that strictly play that instrument. Now, the bongo formed at the same time in Cuba as the conga, and there's not a lot of back tracing as far as where exactly what the influences are. But one thing that you can very closely see is, especially with the new triple bongo, which is impractical but cool, is very similar to how the omele bata was used. We just have 3 pitches of drums that they trade off, and they are really a soloist within the ensemble. But from the new instruments that we have 2 that really lead the push on everything. We have the clave, and we have the cowbell. Okay. So the African bell pattern that I talked about earlier, that's still very consistent, but it starts to change. They start to figure out new ways to use it. And then we come up with these clave rhythms. So if you've heard of rumba clave or son clave, you've heard which is son clave. Son clave is probably the most heard, the most used, and it's most often found in 2/3 format. So what that means is 2 comes first, which is the bar with 2 beats in it, and then 3 comes second, which is the bar with 3 beats in it. Now, they're used in different ways, but if you look at the accents on the African bell pattern, and imagine it starting on 2, you can hear the son clave. So that's where that rhythm came from. That's why it was influenced that way. But in Cuba, there was a big influence in Haiti, because in 1792, France outlawed slavery, and Haiti was run by France. So all this influence in Haiti was French influence. So then once those slaves, which were right beside Cuba, were freed, they came to Cuba. Now this brings us to the ballroom music from France. It was the contra dance. This is very European, and it's very French, because the French were used to doing this in their ballrooms. They were already doing it. But as this came to Cuba, things changed. Culturally, things changed. So they came up with the danza and the danzon, which were still dances, but they were a lot more Latin. Now this is a rendition of a danzon played on piano, but more typically you'd see these ensembles called orchestras típicas, which were string ensembles, the same way that the French were used to, with very minimalized percussion. 2 of the most important percussion that developed from this ensemble that affected mambo was the güero, which I talked about with the scratchers, and then the timbales. Originally they weren't timbales, but they were really close. They were Creole timpani. And you can hear the percussion when it's playing in the back. But a lot of what we're seeing is that the percussion hasn't hit its spotlight yet. It has not come to light. But we do see later, in later centuries, that the danzon formed something called nueve ritmo, which was a section at the end of a danzon, which was a percussion solo. So now we have the light. Now we can express and kind of be a little more forward with how we were playing things. And that directly influenced the montuno section of the mambo, which is, again, is a very percussion-heavy spot. Now, this was what I was talking about. Timbales were originally, they were like timpani. They were like classic timpani that we see in these upper-class ballroom situations and orchestras. But they started out making them more portable, by making them smaller, and then eventually they turned into something entirely different when they started using oil drums as the metal shells of the timbales. But one thing that's really interesting with the timbale is it embodies so many of these concepts. They can play the African bell patterns on the bell, but on the side they play a cascara pattern, which is something also derived, but it's for quieter times of the piece. And like I said, mambo, a lot of things that we are seeing other instruments from different sections of this timeline come together to form something new. Now, Tito Puente, if you haven't heard of him, look him up. He's the mambo king. And this is an example of how everything comes together to form this piece. Because they're forming these things and they're putting on top of it things that they were already trying to do, but they're upbeat. They're no longer ballroom dances. They're now coming into what we're going to know as salsa. So in this project, I've done a lot of talking about how Africa had people and had cultures that were brought to these new places. One thing I didn't have time to, and this is just a really dense subject that I'd hope to get to one day, is how these come into the United States. Now, a lot of that forms in salsa, Tin Pan Alley, jazz, New Orleans style jazz, and a lot of things that form post everything that was in these Latin American countries. But that's pretty much all I've got. And I hope this project was something that if you weren't already in tune on it, it would give you a stepping off point, especially a lot of percussions in here, to kind of read into more and kind of find in classical rock, in these things that we're already playing, where these African derivative roots are and how they form and how we use them. Because once you know that, it's easier to see in other pieces, and it's easier to adapt to something once you know the root. But that's my presentation.
I do want to open it up to questions for those of you who are here. Feel free to ask Ramsey any questions, kind of in conclusion of all that, if you have them.
Jill, anything?
Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Y'all have to have some questions. Come on now.
Name every instrument out here.
I mean, I can. I kind of talked about all of them, but we have the conga and the bongo. Now, this is actually the kidi, which is one of the AOA instruments. Then we have the djembe, shakere. These are the Reuben gangan, the talking drums. Then we have all the bells that I talked about. This is the Ibo. I think I talked about everything. This is the pandeiro, which was a Portuguese instrument that they would take and then play in a new way. And then the one thing I didn't talk about was this fun little drum, which is the cuica. It's a friction drum. And I can't do it. Frustrates me. Well,
There we go.
I'm not good at it. But either way, it has a little stick on the inside of the head, and that way you can rub your hands on it, and it creates friction, and then you can press the head and change the pitch. I'm just not very good at it because I'm not culturally acquainted.
So the predecessor of the go-go bell, I forget the name of it.
Gankogwi.
Yes, so that comes from Iwe?
Anyway, yes.
So that comes from a period of time when it's like objects exist before they are instruments. They aren't made to be musical instruments.
Sure, exactly.
And so what was that before it was
So,
an instrument?
Originally, because the Numu were blacksmiths. They created all those weapons. They created the. Realistically, it was probably scraps of metal from their ironwork that they put together. Now, I don't know exactly. I didn't get that far into the root of it, but I would imagine since they were heavy ironworkers and they were very known for their ironwork, that this is something that they had lying around that they adjusted or made into something a little easier. Cool.
Garrett, to answer your question a little bit, on top of that, there's some other really cool African bells. I can show you some in my office later. they would use a lot to synchronize workers. Like you think about like I actually remember there was like even fishing communities, like even modern time fishing communities, like when they pull in like a fishing net, like it's a really heavy net, and so they need to synchronize the timing of them pulling it in and when they're able to reset and pull it in. So you have one dude whose entire job it is to play these little thumb bells, you know, and to keep everyone in time, and then they pull in time to the music with that kind of stuff. But so a lot of it is like kind of like that. You have things that look a little bit more like kind of a pea pod. You have certain little things. So that's just one particular form factor. That there probably is a predecessor that was more like that is definitely a musical instrument at this point. Similar with djembe, similar with like A-way drums. Like those weren't something else.
Right.
But they started making music with things that were, if that makes sense. So they evolved to the point of this. Even the A-way drums are still evolved to be A-way drums over time.
Thank you.
To that.
That's why he's the guy.
Can you share either something that surprised you in your research or something that you really enjoyed learning about? Maybe a factoid.
That's a good one. I don't know. My biggest thing was just getting into the different modes of music and how they form things just off themselves culturally, especially since I've always loved the djembe, but I never got to see a lot of why and how those rhythms were formed, only that they were. So this project really opened my eyes and gave me an ability to spend time researching and spend time finding those things.
I have two, but
No.
the first one, this is something I fixated on when I heard you talking about it. What kind of skin was the djembe head made out of?
So in Guinea, a lot of times it was goat skin. Now it turned into calf, and then now it's a synthetic. But originally it was going to be goat skin that was stretched over it in like Papua New Guinea and regions in West Africa.
And number two, you said that like you hope this is a good stepping stone, like a good starting off point. If this is a starting off point, like if we were to go dive deeper into this, what do you suggest to be the next step? Like where would you suggest that we go? Like
Great
guide us
question.
into a particular direction.
That's a great question. I can actually send you all my references. I actually have the books that are up here that I use most, the Ed Uribe books. But from mambo, the closest stepping point is going to be salsa. That's just the next progressive step. But you can also see a lot in jazz, things that were taken from this, even in how they played bell patterns, how they played different things on the drum set. Because most everything, all the books that I used were drum set books. Everything's oriented toward drum set because it's really easy to put these, ethnomusicological theories and practices onto drum set. It's a fun word. I'm sorry.
And actually, that's it's totally up to Ramsey. But Ramsey also, in combination with this presentation, did write a paper on this. And so you definitely, that would have all of the bibliography and references that he used.
And I can send it to you.
So yeah, so really, if you are interested in that, it might be worth just posting in the studio page, and then anybody else who's not on the studio page who's interested, just reach out to Ramsey to get that.
How long was your paper, Ramsey?
28 pages. Top to bottom, it's 40 because I have a lot of references, but 28 of content. It was a lot of fun to write. Don't get me wrong, I like writing papers, and it was a headache, but it was a lot of fun once I actually got into writing and researching about it. Do you have any other questions? What's up, Owen?
When are you going to Africa?
When am I going?
Yeah.
Omar, I've been trying to go to Africa for a long time. COVID broke me up. I was supposed to go to Ghana for about 5 weeks, but then COVID happened, and I keep trying, but then something always comes up, and then the fear of getting locked out of the country or something, it keeps breaking me down. Maybe this summer. I have a passport. We'll see. Yes.
Out of all instruments, which one is your favorite?
The djembe, by far. I think the djembe is very cool. It's also, second to the conga, it is one of the most prevalent hand drums. And I think it doesn't get enough light because you can do so many things with it. You make different tones, like the bass tone, the normal solid tones, and then a slap. It's really fun to play. If you want to check that out, you can play it later.
Play us something on it?
No, I can't. You can come play something on it if you want. Okay. Awesome. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank y'all so much for coming again. Yeah.
No, okay. After the game is over.